Okay, I've begun to sew these triangles on now. And you can see how well they fit. You know, one thing I wanted to talk about was I wanted to talk about fabric grain a little bit, because once you get into triangles, you're dealing with not necessarily the straight grains of the fabric, but on the long side here, well, depending on how you cut it, you're going to run into what I call, or what is called, a bias. And that's easier to explain and see if you've got a fabric that's woven with a woven design, because the color of the threads that are woven in tell you where the grain is. And all that is the way fabric is woven is there's a set of threads that are held tight, another set that goes across, and they're at right angles. And if you tug on the threads in, as they're woven or across, there's not a lot of play there, because you're actually tugging on the thread itself, and that thread keeps everything in line. But when you cut a triangle, and most often I cut mine so that the grain runs on the right angle, and on this side here you don't have that. And you can see that if I tug on this, it's fairly secure, and I tug on this, it doesn't move. But once I tug on the diagonal, we've got stretch. And I don't really pay attention to a lot of the rules. I very often, since I work with small pieces, don't cut on the grain at all. And I find that, number one, if you're very careful, it doesn't matter. And this pre-basting kind of gives you a thread in a way that stabilizes it a little more than if it was just by itself. But you can see that it still has kind of a stretch to it. Now you can avoid the problem by actually leaving your paper piece in and basting over that, sewing your patchwork together and then taking the paper out. And that's regular paper piecing, and that'll keep everything from stretching out of shape in the meantime. I find that if I'm careful and I don't pull too much, that I don't really have the problem. So what you can do is just start your piece matching up the corners as you normally do. But you can also take another, I'm using a single thread here, just a thread end actually. You can take another needle and just come in and match up the other end and take a little stitch to hold it, because then you're sort of defining where it belongs. And really you just ease the amount of cloth you have in. If you've stretched out of shape, you just kind of push it in and you'll know. And the bigger the span, the more checkpoints you might need. Sometimes I take a little stitch in the center as well. And that way it's kind of secured, because the shorter the space between tacks, the less you really have to worry about it stretching. And you can continue to stitch right over those tacking threads. There's a little bit like the invisible baste at that point, Grain is much more important when you're sewing clothing. I don't really have an issue with it. If you tend to stretch things out of shape a little bit, it's okay. They're going to be secured down to probably a backing or something, so really you can work out some of the bubbles and bumps that way. I very often cut with no regard to grain, really. It's really simply a matter of being careful. And you can even see how this isn't that straight, you know. Once you sew it to another piece, it kind of straightens out, and if it doesn't, it's like, you know, it still holds together. It's kind of like walking along, and I took a step and I wobbled a bit, but I got there anyway, right?